The buffs are in. Who's on top? Who is S tier? Who is pushing the highest of the keys? Plus 17s, by the way, as of recording this video. And who's absolutely sucking the fat one? There are, unfortunately, examples for both of these situations. Fortunately for some, unfortunately for others. And we will be ranking all of the DPS in Mythic Plus. And we don't even know where our spec is gonna land. So while it's hot, let's talk about it. We're gonna be starting off real quick with, obviously, our first contender. And this is going to be Frost DK. And off the bat, it's going to be our first S tier spec. Probably to nobody's surprise. And this is probably a good time to kind of go into what these tiers mean, since there's going to be some spread and you might not like it, but it's not about feelings, it's about facts. I think somebody said this sometime before. It just so happens that the highest of keys, which are 17s as of recording this video, are pushed with a Frost DK. I think it's in every group at the moment, so it has to be S tier. Like, there's nothing else. Frost DK is doing incredibly well. Obviously, it has some crazy damage numbers. It's also super consistent at the top end. Listen, if you play with the Frost DK in your keys, that Frost DK might destroy and you're like, dude, I need some buffs. But in reality, at the very top end, Frost DK has good damage, really good damage. Not the best, not the most amount of damage, but it is a Frost DK and it is consistent across the board with all of the Death Knight goodies that it comes with. Not unlike our Patreon, which is supporting our content, by the way. And if you like what you're seeing and you want to see more of it and you want to support your boys, it actually does really help us a lot. If you check our Patreons, go right on there. There's a bunch of goodies that you can, get if you do decide to become a Patreon. Anything from customized 4K wallpapers with your character on it, immortalized in glorious Photoshop glory, plus access to bloopers, because I've been saying some shit on this video right now that Mokti has cut out, so you don't know how many times I fumbled talking to the camera, but you can know if you become a patron as well. Not to mention early access videos, monthly podcasts with Patreons, and all of that good stuff right down below. Plus, you will be actually helping out your boys to do more cool stuff in WoW, like play Unholy DK. That's only Marcelian, actually, because I play Frost at the moment, because I like damage. What am I going to do? Unholy is actually not that bad. And I do want to say this because I'm going to put it into B tier. It's at the top end of B tier. And I'll tell you why. As of this moment, it's looking like Unholy is getting better and better and better each month. And it might actually catch up to Frost at one point. I don't know if it's going to be better than Frost, but Unholy just does really well in very big fights. Now, it's B tier because it's like about 2 key levels behind Frost Death Knight, and you will see this pattern. I think at the moment Unholies are doing 15s. I think the top Unholy has cleared the first 16 for all Unholies, something like that. You're probably going to see more 16s done by the end of the week, and definitely as you go through the season. So it's not a bad spec just because it's B tier. It's just there has to be a difference between Unholy and all of the specs that go into A tier, which are statistically better across the board. They just do higher keys than Unholy. And when you get to like 16s, 17s, every one of them really matter, because they're not easy. Like, there's a big difference between somebody that just did their first 16 and somebody who's been doing 16s for a couple of weeks, right? Those specs cannot be at the same level, which is why Unholy is in B tier. Similarly, Havoc is also in B tier, but the bottom part of B tier, and you will see as we continuously populate this particular tier that there's even quite a difference between Unholy and Havoc. For instance, Havoc hasn't actually cleared any 16s yet, and it's not looking like it's gonna do that anytime soon. Maybe it is. Maybe there's something about Havoc, I don't know, because last I checked, they didn't really get that many buffs in the latest tuning. So we'll see how that ends up turning out. It's still a solid spec. It's very average in terms of like the high end. And the high end, I mean, people in the 14s, 15s, 16s, 17s. That's range. It's doing 15s. That's great for Havoc. It's probably slightly better than at the beginning of the season, but it's likely still not there yet. We'll see how the season plays out while we reach its conclusion eventually. And Balanced Druid, in a similar situation with Unholy, it is a very good spec. It's very close to being A tier. Like, I actually debated whether or not to put Balanced Druid all the way into A tier, because it's doing 16s. It hasn't done any 17s yet, but it's not doing 16s like across the board, which is probably what you're going to be seeing more from the A tier specs. And there's also like this one dude, one Balanced Druid that's just like carrying the entire spec in the meters, and if there would be like 10 or 15 more other balanced druids like this dude, it would have been an A-tier spec for sure. Now, I don't know if this boy is just cranking. I don't know what he's eating for breakfast. He's doing really well, but that's not a consistent performance across the board, so I cannot really look at one person and rank an entire spec based off of it. But if anything, this dude just really proves that balance has the chops, has what it takes. It's likely very niche, and it's likely still suffering for a lot of sustain issues and tanky survivability rather issues that haven't been resolved whatsoever at all in 4 years. So balance is a B tier spec. Feral is actually a little bit lower. It's a little bit in C tier. Even though top B tier is ahead of bottom B tier, which bottom B tier is ahead of C tier, so there's quite a difference between, let's say, Feral and Havoc, even though you kind of see them very close. It's not that bad, it's not that great either. Feral has received some buffs. I don't think the buffs that it got in the last week or so are going to make any difference. They would have probably made a difference by now, and it doesn't feel like it. I actually don't know exactly how much tankier Feral is as opposed to Balanced Druid. You do have like an extra defensive. That can mean something at the end of the day, but even with the damage, it's fine. It's C tier, but C tier is about like, you know, plus 13s, plus 14s. That's where it is, right? Those are still pretty high keys, higher than 99% of the player base that are doing right now. And that's saying something, so don't just look at C tier and think, oh my god, this is shit, oh, I have to reroll. No, listen, it's still okay. We haven't even gotten to the shit specs yet. Speaking of, oh my god, how the mighty have fallen. Devastation had really good prospects at the beginning of the season, and I am actually surprised as to why it is so low. I don't know if it's because just everybody's playing Augmentation, like the best evokers are Augmentation, because, dude, at the end of the day, listen, I love Devastation in terms of the spec and how it plays. The fact that it's consistently every season kind of like opposite sides of the spectrum with Augmentation, because listen, okay, Augmentation is the last on the list, and we'll get to it, and you probably know where it's gonna land. But I actually kind of like that Devastation is so low because we need to point out the difference between these two specs. It's unreal that this is the 4th season in a row where it's getting no love whatsoever. What does a Devastation have to do to actually perform well in Mythic Plus? That's the mention raids. Low in raids, it's a little bit better. Beast Mastery is also in the shit tier. Now, when I say shit tier, which is D tier, I'm mostly talking about specs that a couple of players have done 13s, maybe a 14 or 2, but the majority are doing like 11s and 12s. That's still pretty high, and that's, you know, compared to everybody else, that's low. That's quite a couple of keys lower, like considering that Frost Death Knights are doing 17s, like, you know, the top 5 Frost Death Knights or something are doing 17s. BM doing this low is kind of bad. It's not, it still has okay damage. It's decent, but it is at the moment the worst performing Hunter spec. It did receive some buffs in the last couple of weeks, similar to Feral. It didn't really seem like they made a big difference. Although after the rework that we just got last week, we are seeing a resurgence of the Hunters. I would have expected that a week later, which is now, we would have seen some more love from Beast Mastery, but it seems like maybe that's where it is, because the majority of the Hunters are probably playing Marksmanship, the range Hunters that is. And Marksmanship is definitely better. It's in C tier. It's doing a key or 2 above Beast Mastery at this point, and probably going to go even higher and higher. Marksmanship is fine. It's nothing really special going on. I've heard there are some issues with Dark Ranger Marksman where it seems like it's just doing a little bit better on BM, but at the end of the day, you know, it is what it is. Statistics are statistics. Key levels are key levels. I'm looking at the numbers. I'm putting the specs based on the numbers in the tier, and Marksman is C tier, a little bit behind Feral, maybe a little bit more behind Feral if I'm being completely honest. But it feels like Marksmanship just needs some proper tuning. Well, it and everybody below it, of course, because as much as we've praised the devs before, the balance between specs right now definitely doesn't feel that good. Sure, everybody's doing very high-end content, which is great, because at the end of the day, that's probably what most people want, right? If you're a Marksmanship player, you want to know, like, listen, can I actually do my, I don't know, my 10s, right? If you're interested in, you know, pushing content, at least, you know, in an average perspective, get your best gear in the game, get your portals, right? If you want to know that, then yeah, Marksmanship can definitely do 10s, way easier than a bunch of other specs, sure. But when you compare it to the number 1s, it's pretty far off, and it's been a while since we've seen this big of a difference. Survival, surprisingly, is way better than Marksmanship. Still not B tier material yet. It is top of the C tier. It's very close to getting into B tier. Actually, Survival is very close to Havoc at this point in terms of the overall performance, but it does feel like a notch below. Again, there's a couple of Survival hunters that are really cranking, but that's just like a few people, right? The rest of the class, or spec rather, is just not played at that level at this point. It did come off of a newly released rework. It's once again similar to Marksmanship. It still had a week to kind of show off the spec. It should be better, theoretically, but we're not yet seeing it in practice. Although, if I recall, last we've seen Survival was pretty low in terms of overall DPS, but we might have just been looking at melee. I know for sure that Feral was better than Survival, so at least it ranked up a little bit. Once again, it's very close to being into B tier, which is, you know, the tier that has Balance and Unholy, and we know that those specs crank. Until then, that's where it's going to be. Now, Arcane has been a tricky one to place because there are, once again, a couple of Arcane Mages that are really pushing the keys. And Arcane has received some nerfs, so I don't really have big hopes that it's going to be any better. It is a B tier spec. The mighty have fallen indeed. It has never been the best mage spec in Mythic Plus, I don't think, maybe since beta, but it is really good. It still does really good damage, and I do want to compare it to the other mage specs in a bit, but Arcane is just really solid, as similar to all the B tier specs. It's a key or two below the top tier players in the game. And I don't think that the best DPSers are playing Arcane. I mean, there's like I said, there's a couple that are really pushing it, but it's likely that they're playing a different mage spec. And that is not Fire. Fuck Fire. Fire is down bad. Well, not as down bad as it used to be, but it is in C tier. And the recent changes are tricky because Fire actually has been a controversial spec, particularly because I'm also maining it. C tier is not terrible, but once again, it's definitely far off from the meta. It's definitely far off from where it usually is in Mythic Plus, funny enough, and that makes people salty because usually Fire Mages are accustomed to being very highly tuned. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad spec. I feel like overall performance or not, it feels very bad having like new talents like the Living Bomb talents kind of underperform. They have been buffed and they do seem to do really good damage. If you do play the Living Bomb talents, as far as I know at this moment, you might be doing some of the best AoE damage in the game, but your single target really suffers, which is not a trade-off that you want to have, especially when you're pushing keys, which is what this tier list is basing these performances on. And definitely not when you're competing with Arcane Mage and some other specs here. In terms of, like, boss damage is still very important, and everybody and their mom can do big AoE damage, so it's not really something that you would want a Fire Mage for. You would probably want a Frost Mage for that, because Frost Mage does that and more, because it is the best mage spec. It's an A tier spec. It's not yet close to S tier, because S tier is essentially the meta of the meta, but it is one of the best casters in the game, period. Kind of has been ever since the expansion launched, has been even at the end of beta as well. It is just very solid. I was actually looking at Frost and Arcane because I thought, like, if you look at the top mages clearing particular dungeons, you kind of see like an even split between Frost and Arcane. That Frost just has that a little bit more damage, and that ends up mattering actually at the end of the day, because Frost is clearing a few more higher keys than Arcane is right now, and you can see that as well. Once again, some of the top Frost mages are even in the top, I think top 10 or top 20 of all keys cleared, but that's like one person, I think, or maybe two people. So it has the potential to, you know, crank it with the best of the best, but it's not quite there yet. Frost is just really solid across the board, has really good boss damage, has really good AoE. It's kind of like the Frost DK of the casters, if we're gonna be honest, with maybe a little bit of simpler playstyle and definitely squishier. Less utility, maybe. I mean, sure, you do have Bloodlust, but who doesn't have Bloodlust? Because there's definitely somebody that brings Bloodlust in those S tier keys. I wonder who that is. We'll get to it eventually. And that is definitely not Windwalker, but Windwalker is actually really good. I don't remember how it was before the recent buffs, but right now it's definitely middle of B tier. It's very close to Unholy and Balance in terms of the overall keys. I think it's just cranking 15s right now, which is a pretty high key. It's really good because Windwalker kind of suffer from I don't want to say an identity crisis, but maybe a tuning crisis. It always felt like it tried to break even, it tried to break the average barrier, and it just hit its head on the ceiling and never quite, you know, rose above the surface level of the water or whatever, right? But now it's kind of peaking. Now it's like, hey guys, I'm here, I can do damage. That kind of feels like how Windwalker is playing right now. I've played with some Windwalkers that just absolutely destroy the meters in the lower end of the keys, so they do have the potential. It seems from the latest tuning with Unholy that the devs are juggling with Shadow Pan and I think, what is it, Master of Harmony or Celestial Conduit? I think it's Celestial Conduit for Windwalker. So they're kind of tuning these back and forth to kind of see exactly where it should land. It might actually be better as the season progresses, but we'll see. I'm not holding up any hopes. So far, it's still pretty good. It's middle of the tier. Tier B tier rather. Ret has been a fan favorite. It's probably still the most played DPS spec. No, it is. Unless it changed from last week. Last week when I checked it, it was definitely the most played DPS spec. It was the first DPS spec that broke over 1 million parses in Mythic Plus, so it is very popular. It's not that great. I think it's just slightly behind Windwalker right now in terms of performance. They're very, very close. Once again, it's doing the 15s. It's cranking really hard, but it's still far from the top of the top, right? Because people like to think that Red is just overpowered. Although we do love Red, it's a fun spec. It deserves its spotlight, and you know how strong Red is. You've definitely seen Red in your group, and maybe that way you can kind of tell how good B tier specs are. They're not that bad. They seem like they're average because we're just looking at the very, very top end of players. There is a little bit of a difference. There's definitely a difference between Red and Unholy, for instance. Unholy is slightly better, but Red is kind of similar in terms of performance with Windwalker and Havoc. I really deliberately placed all of these specs in the position of the tier list so that they make sense. Shadow Priest has kind of fallen, although it kind of was low at the from the beginning of the season. It is C tier, kind of bottom of the C tier. It doesn't really bring anything you would want a Shadow Priest for, since the best healer right now in the dungeons is Discipline Priest. Statistically, it's kind of overtaking Restoration Shaman right now in the 17 category. We're seeing Restoration Shamans start to clear their 17s as well, I think. But because Discipline is so good, all of the stuff you would want a priest for is brought by Discipline, and you really want a little bit of class diversity in the higher end of the key, so you're definitely not going to take a Shadow Priest. The damage is not bad. It's not particularly amazing either. It's fine. It's just Shadow Priest. It's solid. If you don't have a Discipline Priest in your group, you're likely going to want a Shadow Priest probably before you want a Holy Priest, at the very least. If you do want, I don't know, that stamina buff and that Mass Dispel for some reason, right? Shadow is probably going to be good enough for you if you don't have that Discipline. Assassination has been a very happy surprise to see, because maybe it's just been very long since we've done a melee DPS tier list ranking in M+. It is top of the A tier, probably slightly better than Frost Mage, which is something that Assassinations haven't seen since almost forever. Now, if you've been playing Assassination all throughout the War Within, you've probably been playing with such a good spec so far. So you know. But I have seen 0 Assassination Rogues. Or maybe like 1 Assassination Rogue and 1 key in the 10. My boy was cranking, you know who you are. But outside of that, I think Assassinations are just doing way higher keys than I am, so I'm probably just not seeing anyone. It's been tuned really well ever since the launch of the expansion, so it's not that bad. It has really good AoE damage. What more can I say, man? It's been a long time coming, and I'm happy for Assassinations, right? They deserve this spot in the spotlight. Outlaw, some rankings, I think Warcraft logs, are ranking Outlaw very highly. Now, I've looked at the keys done and the overall score of the top Outlaws in the world. They're good, don't get me wrong, but they don't really seem to be that close to Assassination as Warcraft logs and Arcane.gg might like to think. It's pretty solid. It's around Unholy. I think Unholy is just, at this moment, slightly better than Outlaw, I want to say. So Outlaw has suffered a little bit from some design issues, from a lot of bugs. It's still suffering from a lot of bugs. A more recent one that we are probably aware of is the bug that just made Outlaws just crank in 16s. Now, those were rolled back, and this is probably why we're seeing Outlaw right now in B tier, not way higher. And it's likely that Warcraft logs did not roll back their data, and that's probably why they're ranking Outlaws so high. But this is why you kind of have to, get a second opinion, right? When you're looking at all of these rankings, which is what you probably have to do when you look at our tier list as well. Or never stop watching our tier list, because we are 100% correct 100% of the time. We are not human, we're robots from Mars. Outlaw is not though, because otherwise it would be an S tier spec, but it's not, it is a B tier spec. It's solid. I still think that at least the Outlaw theory crafters are very public with the bugs that it has. I still feel like it has an unnatural long list of bugs that they need to be fixed, and I don't know how that's going to affect the overall performance, but as it stands, B tier, still pretty solid, still okay. Holy shit, bro. Holy shit, dude. This has been actually very depressing to see Subtlety's performance compared to everybody else. And they did just come off of a Black Powder 30% buff 2 weeks ago. That did fuck all for Subtlety. It's still, right now, I'm gonna spoil the rest of the tier list. Or is it? No, it's not. It's not. It's almost the worst spec in the game in terms of Mythic Plus performance. We have some damage numbers here on the screen that you can see from the top subtleties in the world. You can still see subtleties still doing decent damage, but you'll notice that it's pretty far behind some of the specs that it's gonna be clearing keys with, which is kind of sad because at this point, if you put Subtlety and a Frost DK in the same group, that Subtlety Rogue is gonna be very sad by the end of that dungeon. It's not okay for the difference to be this big. Now, I don't know if Frost DKs are doing too much damage. I don't know if Subtleties are not doing enough damage. I kind of tend to think of the latter. So I really hope that the devs really approach Subtlety and the rest of the D tier specs at the very least and kind of crank their numbers, because it's obvious from the people pushing the content that these specs they're just not in the same world as the other specs in the game. Elemental is a tricky one right now because Elemental has just been nerfed after recording this video. No, in fact, they've been nerfed before. And right now, as of recording this video, all of the data that we have is from Elemental really doing really well in keys. Very well, actually, and pushing very high content with a lot of damage in a lot of the keys. But they have been nerfed probably a little bit too much, considering that they were not the biggest culprit in the game. So I don't know why they've been hit probably with the biggest nerfs in the latest tuning, and that's just straight. I mean, I guess, sure, maybe nerf Elemental. I'm not a fan of the nerfs, but if you're gonna nerf Elemental, what's going on with the other specs? Like, why just Elemental? Like, what's going on over there? It's been kind of reworked a little bit. So I understand that there were some mastery issues that just cranked Elemental to like crazy amounts. I don't know if it was a bug or it's just a scaling issue. So I don't know where Elemental is gonna be in a week's time. Maybe the nerfs are just gonna take it down a peg and put it like balanced Druid level, because there is actually a big difference as of now between Elemental and balanced Druid. It is just the world that we live in, which is why, you know, there's this discrepancy between the tiers. Elementals, rejoice while it lasts, or maybe the nerfs weren't that bad. Maybe by the end you're still gonna be an A tier spec. I really hope. I'm rooting for you, man. I love my Elementals. It's one of my favorite classes. Specs, rather. Well, my favorite Shaman spec is coming up next. And boy, oh boy, is Enhancement on crack, dude. Some weird World of Warcraft crack, by the way. It's the safe kind. Stay in school. Enhancement is crazy pumping, man. Like, in terms of damage, like, I don't know if it matters if I do this, if I do stuff like this, because every top keys, every 17 is done with an Enhancement and a Frost Death Knight. It doesn't really matter which one is better than the other, because you're not doing a key with only one of these two. You're definitely doing a key with both of these, as of this video. Of course, it is doing more damage than Frost Death Knight, it seems, just from looking at some of the top players in the world. And it's so good, dude. It's so good. It's significantly squishier than Frost Death Knight, so I don't know if Enhancement would be performing this high up without an augmentation in their group. But you can probably say the same about most specs. But I really feel like Augmentation might do a lot of heavy lifting for their Enhancement brothers, because they're still kind of squishy. I mean, when you compare it to Frost Death Knight, of course. Otherwise, there's not much to say, especially if you're running some of the top keys with a Discipline Priest. Enhancement does give you that freedom to not take the Resto and take the Discipline, because it can bring that Poison Cleansing Totem and that Curse Dispel, which are so good in some of these top keys, and you definitely cannot clear them without a Shaman in your group. So it's either going to be a Resto Shaman, and you can probably fill in with some casters, or a Discipline Priest, and you then put your Enhancement back on the roster. So that's for the S tier at the moment. Affliction has received some changes, some buffs, some nerfs. It's currently bottom of the B tier, which is not that bad. It's doing decently keys. I think it's around like what is it, the 14s, maybe it's doing some 15s at this moment. You can see it on the screen. It's a lot of specs with a lot of key levels, so I tend to sometimes forget exactly where Affliction is, but it is there. It's doing okay. Warlock is not in its best season so far, but it could be worse. It could be a sub rogue. So at the end of the day, it's not that bad. Demonology, however, is the loser of the Warlock spec and the bottom of the seat here. And this is where, you know, there's quite a difference between Demonology and Devastation. Demonology is still doing okay keys and decent damage, of course, but it's still above Devastation and it's not quite yet into D tiers. I have seen demos cranking raids really hard. It doesn't feel like it translates into Mythic Plus. I don't know if it's probably a tuning issue, because that's pretty much what you can do for a Warlock. Warlock does have good utility where you would want it in a group, but not enough to pick it over not having enough damage, which is probably the biggest issue that Warlock has right now. Destruction is the best one so far, because it also has been nerfed. Not as hard as Elemental, but also why nerf Destruction though? Jesus. It's been a day and a half as of recording this video of the new, let's say, numbers for Destro, and it's still doing pretty well. I'm not sure if it's going to drop more because of the nerfs or the other spec is just going to climb a little bit higher, but as of now, it is statistically the best Warlock spec, a little bit better than Affliction, not by too much. So at the very worst, maybe they can just trade places in a week's time if the nerfs are too big. I really wish we could stop seeing these nerfs to like average specs instead of just nerfing top specs or just buffing everybody that's suffering right now, like Arms, which is the official crowned loser of the season. I am slightly happy and slightly unhappy. I know there's a lot of Arms players out there that really like playing Arms, and I don't want you to have a bad experience and bad gameplay. I really don't like their design of Arms, so I'm kind of happy that it's dog shit right now. But it's likely, even if they buff Arms, that's not going to change. We are after a bunch of nerfs for Arms, and more warrior buffs have been announced. I don't know if they've been implemented yet, or it's with the next reset. Probably been implemented right now. So it's likely we're going to see Arms maybe overtake Subtlety, maybe even Beast Mastery. I don't have high hopes that it's going to reach C tier level yet. It doesn't feel like that's going to be the case. It's great that it's getting buffs, and if anything, the other D tier specs needed the same kind of love that Arms got. I don't know why they're taking so long to kind of dodge this. Like, I can feel my Subtlety and Beast Mastery brothers and sisters out there struggling to kind of keep up with everybody. Arms is here. It might be a little bit higher in a week's time. That's all I wanted to say. And lastly, Fury is not doing that bad as it was. Not lastly, actually, we have one. I hoped we wouldn't get to the last one. But Fury right now is actually middle of the B tier spec, so it's doing pretty well. Pretty high keys. Some of the players that are cranking with Fury right now are some of the best warrior players in the world, so they're doing a lot of heavy lifting for taking Fury a little bit higher. But it is higher than Windwalker, higher than Ret Paladin, which is not something that a lot of people like to agree with, because Fury has been nerfed bad. Maybe too bad, but it also has been buffed, similar to Arms. Once again, since it's fairly early after the buffs, it's not very clear if these buffs have affected the top players pushing keys. Maybe they haven't woken up to do their keys yet. Maybe they're doing it over the weekend. So it's kind of like a, you know, up in the air at the moment. It's pretty good, and it can only get better from here, by the way. So maybe that's like kind of like a saving grace. And last and least, because I don't like what it's doing to the game, Augmentation is the king. If there was a best S tier spec, it would probably be Augmentation, because even if you take an Enhancement and the Frost DK from a group, you cannot really take an Augmentation from the group if you're pushing the keys. I think it's a flaw in the design system that Augmentation is so good. You've heard this before. I love support specs, and I hope that we get more support specs, but the way Augmentation is just enabling people to actually be able to clear keys, it's like a content enabler. That's a bad way to have a spec in, and that's the main reason why it's going to be an S tier spec for the foreseeable future. It's doing really good, has really good damage. I think it has way more damage than ever before, but that's probably because they swapped its tuning from providing the buffs to the players to actually doing its own performance as well, which is actually a better case scenario, but that's just damage, right? You're not taking it for the damage in the keys, and everybody who's doing that knows that you're taking it for the survivability of your tanks, of your DPS specs, of that Enhancement Shaman that just dies so quick. But that's how it's going to look at the moment in this particular stage of the meta. And even if there are big losers and big winners in this tier list, the specs are actually really fun to play. There's a lot of fun specs, and pretty much all of them are enjoyable to play except Arms Warrior and Balance Druid. But we do have a top 3 melee specs that we enjoy so much to play, and you'd be surprised that they might not be the S tiers you believe they are. And you can check it on this video right now.